All right, that super cool music you're hearing means it's time for Stupid Gen X Tricks, the show where a couple of geezers talk about the music and movies and TV and tech that shaped our generation and what it all means today.
You are correct, Dave. And today we're going to be talking about the geography of Gen X. Where were the great and exciting scenes that all that music and culture were coming out of? Places like Athens, Georgia, that we talked about a few episodes ago, where REM and the B-52s, among others, came up, and Manchester, UK, where you had, New Order and the Smiths way back in the 80s, and then more recently, Oasis and Kevin De Bruyne and others. And it's going to be fun.
Yep. And we'll talk about New York City and all the different waves of not just music, but writing and comedy and visual arts and fashion, all sorts of things that have come and gone from different parts of towns all over the world.
And I think we'll spend at least a little bit of time with the scene that I think is most associated for people with Gen X, which is the one that was captured in the movie Singles, and that's Seattle world, where grunge bands like Nirvana were sort of living side by side with, Microsoft and Amazon and a lot of the tech revolution that was going on in the 90s, for just kind of a crazy mashup there.
Yeah, or for those who wisely overlooked that mess in Seattle, and looked over the Atlantic to England, and where shoegaze was rightfully ascendant.
Dave, let me just say whatever. But we will also be talking more than folks might expect about the city that I call home these days, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because our guest is going to be writer David Rullo, an expert on all these kinds of scenes, and he's the author of this book right here, Gen X Pittsburgh. That people who are obsessive enough about this show that they zoom in tightly on my image will have noticed sitting on the bookshelf over my shoulder throughout the time here.
I mean, I like to do that even in my quiet moments, David.
I don't like to think about that, Dave.
Then we will wrap up, as always, with our world-famous Wormholes segment, where we try to surprise and impress one another. And really, David makes me go first so he can come out of it and say, oh, yours is way better. Mine will just not do.
Well, spoiler alert, my wormhole this week is going to include a strong horticultural component. So you've got that to look forward to. And before we bring our guest in and go to a 3-day
Are you confirming your own theory there?
I'm just saying that, plant life will be discussed. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on, where you come down on such things in the world. But let's keep it at 2 Daves for right now. And I just want you to rank your affinity for some of these scenes. Which do you think either were the most influential or just where you would most have wanted to be part of it? So there's the downtown New York 1970s CBGB scene, where you've got, the Ramones and the Talking Heads and Blondie and all this incredible energy going on there, alongside the whole Andy Warhol factory thing going on and other stuff. You've got the Seattle in the 90s, and we know how you feel about that, but most people would enjoy that time and place. LA in the 80s and 90s,
I love Citizen Dick.
Yeah. All right. So you've got something going on there. That's the band from the movie, right? Yeah. All right. Super Train. I just want to ride the Super Train. The LA in the 80s and 90s, when you had a lot of, really important punk in the sort of next wave of that, with people like the Red Hot Chili Peppers and X and others, plus, the next wave of the hip hop scene. Really, was driven out of LA in the 90s, alongside the indie film world that was going on there. You've got Athens and also Chapel Hill in the 80s and 90s. You've got Manchester that we talked about in the 80s and 90s. So where's Dave going into the Wayback Machine and placing himself out of all these, or rank those 5, or throw in some others if you want?
Yeah, well, I mean, the cultural anthropologist in me might have a slightly different answer from the music head in me, I would say, because there was like I find Athens infinitely fascinating as a surprising place for greatness to come from musically. But in terms of the sort of number of acts that were bubbling up, gosh, it's hard. I guess I would say, just for my kind of music, Manchester, England, in the 80s and 90s, there was so much coming out of there. But I might just choose New York and the scene around CBGBs in honor of my poster and all those bands. I feel like seeing Blondie and the Talking Heads in their ascendancy would have been pretty incredible.
Yeah, I think that would be number one for me too. Just because it's so much the music that I love, and it's funny because of course, like I lived in the New York area in that time period, but as a child who had zero sense at all of anything going on down there, and then I guess in high school, when that scene had sort of already peaked, we would occasionally go, to shows there and summers in college, but it just wasn't the same. It was almost like you were going to a theme park at that point of a thing that had been really cool 10 years earlier. But I think that it's funny. LA, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in LA in my life and I've never really had much affinity for it, but there was a ton of good stuff going on there in that period. And I do think the cultural overlaps are so interesting in all these places of, we focus so much on the music, but like that music happening and all the people who were making it were hanging out with people who were making movies and TV and doing interesting things in those world, and it all blending together. That would be kind of a neat thing to get to watch up close to, I think.
Yeah. When you mentioned Chapel Hill, which wouldn't necessarily have been one of the first that I'd mention for a music scene on par with, Seattle or Manchester or New York exactly, but reminded me of a band that I saw in Cleveland in college. If memory serves, it was a Chapel Hill band that opened for the Jesus and Mary chain when they were playing at the Agora.
Superchunk?
No. It was a band called The Veldt, VELDT. Yeah, they were they were really good. At least my memory of them on stage was that they were tremendous. It was definitely an indie, kind of dark band, appropriate to open for Jesus and Mary chain, really, with a black lead singer. And I was just like, these guys are it. These guys are the next big thing. They were so good. And then, I gather things kind of went off the rails for them, and they got an album out, but the album wasn't anywhere near as good as my memory of them live. And, it reminds me that you sometimes you see buzzed about bands and they're not what you're expecting. And sometimes you see bands you've never heard of and they're way more than you were expecting. And I want to just say a little shout out to the Veldt for what they once were, because that was a cool band.
That's great. Is there much of a music scene in Little Rock?
There is a music scene here, but I must confess I tend to go to live music after I've fallen in love with recorded albums, and most of the recorded stuff that I get into is from bands elsewhere. So I'm not like one of these. I think you're like this, right? You're like, let's go see some music. What's playing tonight? All right, let's go to that one.
Yeah,
I don't do that.
I will occasionally do that, and almost always find it rewarding, even if it's not a band that I ever listen to or care about again. I just like hearing and I like that atmosphere. I stumbled last week into David Byrne has a cool book that he wrote a few years back just about music and has a bunch of different essays. One of them is one that I was happy to stumble into about what makes a scene. And it was all about CBGBs. And what made that into such a thing. And I asked about Little Rock because, one of the big components for him is you have to be located someplace where struggling artists can actually afford to live. And we really noticed that when we moved, here from the DC area, where there wasn't much of a local music scene, in large part because, like, if you were a band, you can't, unless you have some great day job and you're really focused on that, you can't afford to live in the DC area particularly. Whereas here, people actually can do it, and there's much more going on. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, there's a whole thing about in the world of placemaking and culture building is you need to have kind of up and coming neighborhoods where the kind of artist set can afford to live in group homes and run around with each other. That's what, the East Village was in New York in the 70s and early 80s. Nowadays, nobody that was a part of that, none of those incomes could support a lifestyle there. You got to New Jersey or somewhere very, very far out in one of the outer boroughs.
Yeah, I think Byrne said his rent at that point, living with whatever group of people he was living with, was like $100 a month. And which is ridiculously cheap even for the 1970s. And that's what it needs to be, to have people who can spend their time thinking about how am I going to, make entirely new music in the world. But this seems like a good place to break for a minute and come back with our guest. But first, we do have to ask the audience, Dave, to show their support for this particular Pittsburgh Little Rock scene by liking, subscribing, reviewing, telling their friends, all the things that make podcasts get out there in the world. Really, it all boils down to word of mouth, and your mouths are the ones that need to be making words.
Yeah, and I do think perhaps some of our supporters could show their affection for the show by hiring a drone show to honor us that could fly over certain stadiums. Perhaps, hopefully it doesn't get shut down. Whatever. Just get the word out. Hire a drone show.
So you've moved on from the skywriting to a drone show. That's you're staying in tune with the times. All right.
Yeah, kind of. Also, just don't go over the Polish border, and then maybe next time if keeping it
newsworthy. There we go.
Yeah. And then perhaps newsworthy circa 6 to 8 weeks previous to when we record these things. Also I'm giving some thought to for the hiking set that supports us, they could lay out branches or leaves in a giant pattern that could be photographed from the air and then shared on social media, because that's a thing people do, right? Or you could make a Burning Man.
No, I've got it, Dave. You have to arrange, and I know that you have the pull to do this, that at the next Michigan State Spartans home game, one of those shows where everybody holds up a placard of different colors and it spells out stupid Gen X tricks and has the little logo with the thing that's not at all copied from MTV and isn't a copyright violation.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And maybe we can get Eminem to wear a hoodie that says stupid Gen X tricks when they do a cutaway of him at a Tigers game.
You guys hang out, right?
Constantly. I was just saying, I was reading about Eminem. No, actually watching a documentary that's kind of interesting about his super fans. And it reminded me that I had tickets and attended the world premiere of 8 Mile at the Toronto Film Festival, where he was going to be there in the audience with us watching the premiere. And he got detained at the border for marijuana and never made it to the screening. I was super bummed. That's my only, that, and I think I was within 100 yards of him at one of the Video Music Awards.
Well, I'm just glad that they let you through, Dave. But we will break now, and then we're going to come back with the writer David Rullo, who, as I said, is the author of the really fun book Gen X Pittsburgh, which is all about the scene that emerged in the Southside Flats neighborhood here in the 1990s. which, didn't have a huge impact on the broader culture. The only kind of national breakthrough act was Rusted Root, but was really, really important in this city's transformation, kind of out of the ruins of, the collapse of the steel industry in the 70s and 80s, and into the really punky, cool place that it is today, which is another, thing that these kinds of cultural scenes really do.
All right. We'll be right back.
This is pure rock passion. And it's gonna take your buzz to the next level. It's Buzz Ballads, the biggest alternative rock power ballads of all time on 2 incredible CDs. You can't get this 2 CD collection in any store. These are the biggest names in rock, belting out their hugest hits, all together on Buzz Ballads. Order this collection online at MusicSpace.com. Get Buzz Ballads, because this is what the buzz is all about. To order, call the number on your screen or log on to MusicSpace.com. Rush delivery available.
So now we're going to welcome our third David, or Dave, whichever he ends up being in this setting, David Rullo, who we're going to start, Dave, by asking you the question that we ask everybody who comes onto the show, which allows us to properly assess you as a human being and where you stand on all these things. What was the first record album that you ever bought for yourself?
Wow. So that's an embarrassment.
There's no bad
join the
answers.
masses.
There's no bad answers.
David's was Captain and Tennille.
Okay.
So,
it was Pipes of Peace by Paul McCartney. But it was because
his very finest work, I think.
Exactly. The reason though was because Say 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 was on it with Michael Jackson.
Right.
So that was
There you
the
go.
first.
Okay. Well,
that was an LP, or did you buy the Say 45?
No, it was an LP. Yeah.
you go.
The first 45 I can remember owning that I bought myself was, and I still have it downstairs, Prince's When Doves Cry, and it says on the back of it from the forthcoming movie,
Purple Rain. Yeah. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
That is cool.
Yeah.
That's cool.
But
okay, cool.
My musical taste quickly evolved from there, though. So.
As most people note, once they get over with the thing they bought when they were 6 or whatever. Yes. Okay, cool. So we want to talk about the broader concept of a scene here today, since that's something you have some real expertise in, and something David and I both find fascinating. So you wrote the Gen X Pittsburgh book, and things went down at, I believe it's called the Beehive Coffee House.
That's right. There were 3 or 4 locations. The Beehive was certainly the first and the most memorable location, but there was also, depending on what day of the week and what you were into, the Upstage that had a big goth scene, and there was Metropole that had an industrial dance scene. And there was, those are 3 of the bigger locations. In Oakland, there was a second Beehive, but it was different than the Southside of Pittsburgh, because it was college students mostly, where the Southside was a mix of people. You'd get beats from who were in their 60s, right? And you would have kids who were not yet who hadn't yet graduated from high school on the Southside location. It was a very different scene from the Oakland one.
It's funny you mentioned Metropole, because that's a place that the bands I was into, the more like industrial gothy stuff, Front 242,
right,
that kind of thing. I remember seeing Metropole appearing a lot on tour lists, but never
the backs of T-shirts, maybe. Yeah.
No, it was, I was like a real student of Polestar. Do you remember that publication?
Yeah.
That was where you found out, if you were lucky enough to be a student with access to a subscription, not only could you see who was touring and where they were going, you could see box office figures on or ticket sales for all the different shows, which could be pretty interesting because different cities could respond radically differently to different acts.
Yeah, and certainly Metropole was where I saw a lot of those bands. I saw Skinny Puppy and KMFDM, and I mean, just a whole plethora of industrial bands back in the day.
Oh yeah, that's a good lineup. David, I think missed all of those great acts because he was too busy like talking with people in coffee houses about Elvis Costello or whatever.
Yeah. But well, I did a lot of that as well. I
so you're like a hybrid.
Yeah, I probably was right now. I'm a journalist now, and so that was probably where I was back then, a mixture of the scenes.
All right. So talk a little bit. I mean, it really comes through in the book, and it's a story that has been well told in other venues, but I really like this as the framing for it, where Pittsburgh as a city was at in the 1980s and how this scene kind of grew out of that and the impact that it had on what the city went on to become.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you cannot underestimate the effect of Generation X on Pittsburgh. In 1988 and 89, the city was basically a Rust Belt city that was going through a lot of economic woes and trying to figure out what was going to be its next step. It was leaning towards technology and academia and some other things and medical. But in 1990, when people started to think about art as and using Pittsburgh as a location, definitely the Southside was an easy pick because of a lot of the places were vacant. A lot of the storefronts were vacant. They had been places where the steelworkers and the supporting industries had lived and had drank and were able to find meals and things like that. And so by 91, when the Beehive was opening up, it was right for students, art students who were moving in and musicians who were looking for cheap rent, but close to, where they would be able to perform. And Gen X really transformed the South Side. It went from like any other neighborhood that was suffering through an economic morass to a really, really vital community that was made up almost exclusively of Gen X kids.
All right. Before we move on and broaden the lens beyond Pittsburgh, I do have a little bit of audience service that I realize I need to do here because one of our recent episodes, I was bad-mouthing the Mexican food situation here locally. And then actually the day that...
You got picketed?
What's that? I did not. I have not, fortunately, unlike David, had that experience. But no, I realized actually the day that episode published and I had listened to that little bit again, we ended up going to what turns out to be a great place in the neighborhood that David writes about there on right on East Carson Street, La Bodega, really like good, authentic Mexican tacos. So if you're coming through town, that's the place to go. And audience service completed, and we can go back to talking about whatever we want to talk about now.
Well, before
you want to check the window to see if everyone dispersed after you said that.
Yes.
But before you broaden, it's interesting you bring up food because when I first started to live downtown, there was like a Rax in the city and that was it, right? Maybe a Subway. There was, and Rax was like an Arby's sort of place, right? There was nothing in terms of a food scene. And now Pittsburgh is really thought of as like a foodie community. And that was, again, really Gen X and Lawrenceville and the South Side and East Liberty and a lot of the communities really spending time and figuring out what scenes were worth it to delve into.
Yeah, it's not just pierogies anymore.
That's right. Thank God.
Yeah.
Or else I'd be 10 times bigger, right?
Well, can you take a step back and give the folks who haven't read your book a little sense of what you cover and what pops?
Yeah. So the book is about there was the first coffee house in the city was a place called the Beehive. And it was started by two Gen X Jewish kids that grew up in Pittsburgh and were looking for a business venture, and they traveled to California to go see the Grateful Dead, and had seen these coffee houses, and someone they knew had said to them, coffee was going to be the next big thing. You should really look into this. And so they started a coffee house on the Southside at a time in Pittsburgh. I mean, I touched about it a second ago, but Pittsburgh was really looking for an identity. It had been a steel town. It had been industrial, and it didn't have much more than that, right? There were the Steelers and the Pirates, and that was it. I mean, even the Penguins weren't anything back then, right? So it was really looking for an identity, and it was through the Beehive. It was through a few other things, but the Beehive was one of the primary movers of getting this city to have an identity about where it could lay its head on. And so the book takes a look at that. It takes a look at some of the other communities that sort of came up at the same time, and some of the other figures and clubs and things like that. I mean, he touches on them very briefly, but that's the book.
You know, whenever people talk about the early days of coffee culture, I'm reminded of a scene that you both may recall or not recall from Roger.
Before you say it, I just want to, okay, that wasn't it. I was going to guess So I Married an Axe Murderer, but go ahead.
I haven't seen that.
You got to see that. That's great. Okay. Anyway.
So Roger and Me, you know, it was the first documentary from Michael Moore, you know, and he's going after the General Motors executive, I think, Roger Smith, for closing factories or whatever. And there's a scene where he's sort of doing autobiographical stuff about saying, well, I used to live in San Francisco and edited a magazine called Mother Jones. But San Francisco was just getting so weird. I mean, and he has this thing about and they had coffee houses with they have places that are just for coffee, and then cuts to this bored looking 80s hipster woman saying, kind of down her nose into the camera, latte, double latte. And that was like a laugh line in the movie. And I remember seeing that and thinking, that's so weird. What is a latte or a double latte? And that San Francisco is strange. You gotta admit, that was my introduction to the rise of coffee culture was Michael Moore himself.
Yeah. And it was very different. Scott and Steve didn't know anything about coffee, right? They actually stole a pamphlet that Starbucks had put out in Chicago. You know, there were only two locations at the time, Seattle and Chicago, and they stole one of their guides to educate consumers about what these drinks were, because no one had ever heard of them before. So they actually created this scene in Pittsburgh. It was so much more than coffee, right? And it was so much more than sort of the beat. When people think about coffee houses and they go back to So I Married an Axe Murderer, right? And it's sort of the beat coffee houses where everyone's wearing a turtleneck and snapping, right? I mean, this was way to differ. Obviously, that was its ancestor, right? But I mean, the kids at these places it was so different. It was, there was 10 feet of smoke hanging in the air, and there was loud music, and there was really loud conversation taking place, and it was bright Gen X colors. So, a lot of greens and yellows. And I mean, it was definitely grew up from the beat scene and really became something else, filled with, there were games taking place all the time, and just a completely different scene from the beats. It was, I mean, obviously the spiritual ancestor, but completely different.
David Byrne, in his book about music, has this great chapter on, the CBGB scene in the 70s that he was a part of, and what are the elements that make for a great scene. And one of the things that stuck out to me in it was he talks about having place to hang out. Right. And so that one of the things that the CBs did was the artists who played there, they would let in for free on other nights, and even give them free drinks and stuff, so that it became the place where people would just congregate. And that obviously attracted other people to hang out there, but it created this, place where people could interact with each other. I mean, I guess the two questions would be, right, one, was that sort of part of how the Southside worked? But also, like, what do you think now in this world where people don't hang out together in physical places so much anymore? Does that change the nature of the whole thing?
Yeah, I think it does. To answer your second question first, I really think it changes everything, right? I think that the Beehive was in that classic sort of, there's this theory of the third space, right? It's not really your home, it's not your work,
Right.
but it's the other place you go. And that was the Beehive and some of these other places on the South Side, like D's, which was a dive bar across the street from the Beehive, where it was sort of like the Beehive but served alcohol, right? And everyone's hung out there when they weren't at the Beehive. And there were a few other locations on the South Side. But this idea of sort of cross-pollination that happens in these sort of third places just can't happen now. The kids aren't hanging out like they used to. If you went into the Beehive, if you went into a few of the other coffee houses or D's or some of the other, like the Electric Banana or some of the places here in Pittsburgh that were sort of those scenes, right? The Electric Banana was the punk club, the hard rock club, right? There's 31st Street Pub. There were all these different places where people would go, and it was everyone sort of knew everyone, recognized everyone, but you would be talking about, hey, I'm planning on writing this book, I'm working on this story, and then the guy behind you would be talking about a film that he was making, and the guy across the way was talking about an album that he was making, and all of a sudden the three of you would be sort of converging on some project, right? And it really, that scene was created because everyone was within earshot of one another and could hear each other and talk to each other. It wasn't just being in that space. It was being in a space before there were cell phones and before there were laptops, and no one was looking down, right? Everyone was looking at each other and curious about what everybody else had to say. Those scenes just don't happen. I don't know what happens to the world. I mean, I hate to sound like some old guy, right? But I don't know what happens to the world without those kind of things.
That's you're in the right place to sound like one, so it's good.
Right. Yeah, let me just tell you real quick. I was interviewing somebody for my book at a coffee house on the South Side. And we were upstairs and we were talking no louder than this. But a girl who had headphones on, and she was clearly studying, right? But she takes off her headphones and she looked at us and she said, you guys are just so loud. Could you just please keep it down so I can study? I said, you're in a coffee house. Like, people are supposed to talk. And she said, that is not helpful at all. And she sort of walked away.
I think you just made the world a better place.
I don't know.
I hope.
But perhaps she needed some counseling after that.
Right. That's right.
So speaking of scenes in Pittsburgh, where does, and you guys are the savvy locals and I am not. I just read The Mysteries of Pittsburgh. I only read that book about Pittsburgh, which is not, it's fiction, right? So how does that, and I read it decades ago, so I don't remember it very well, but I liked it a lot. How does that play into that world in any substantial way for you guys?
For me, it does. I've been on I actually went on a walking tour of all the locations, and a lot of those locations, it was probably 5 to 7 years before me. So like, I think of it as like my older brother. If I had an older brother, my older brother's scene. But a lot of those same places, I'm blanking on, why can't I think of his name now?
Michael Chabin.
Yeah, Michael Chabin. He worked at Gary's Bookstall, and that was a place that I went to religiously to buy books. There were 3 or 4 other places in there that he mentions that we used to hang out at. I think that was a real, it put Pittsburgh on the map in terms of Gen X, I think.
Yeah, I can boast of a good personal connection, only that he briefly mentions in the book a particular townhouse complex that was supposed to be a place where lots of criminality occurred and bad people lived. And that was actually the first place we lived when we moved here. And found out later. So I get some street cred for that, I guess. But what was the criminal enterprise you were hired to do here, David? Educating young people.
Well, that has been criminalized to some degree.
Yes, yes.
Okay. We say we're not political, but then we make comments like this, and meaning I just did. But it happens. It happens every episode.
Yeah. One of the things, I mean, we've been very guilty of it so far in this episode, and I think everybody's guilty of, when we talk about these scenes, the easiest thing to talk about is music. But there's a lot of other cultural stuff that intersects with those, and I'm sort of curious actually to ask both of you, Dave Rullo as a writer, and you, Dave Anderson, with your artistic past, how does being part of a scene like that play in, and where have you seen that affecting your own life and work?
Did you want me to take that first, or you want to take it, Dave?
Yeah, you go ahead.
All right,
You're the special guest.
Yeah, I think that the nice thing, the special thing about Pittsburgh is we had a whole lot of railroad and steel barons that when they died were afraid they were going to go to hell. And so they donated a whole lot of money to the cultural scenes.
Yeah.
That really, even when Pittsburgh was thought of as nothing more than a beer and a shot kind of town, we still had all of these places, right? And these sort of underground scenes that we're talking about. And so there was a strong underground art scene. There was a strong underground writing scene. Certainly Hemingway's in Oakland was there. But, the museum scene in Pittsburgh is amazing. The gallery scene in Pittsburgh, especially in the 90s, before art became such a commodity, was really a big deal in Pittsburgh, in Shadyside and on the Southside. And, in the Southside, you could just you'd walk down the street and there were all of these weird sort of places that were half antique shop, half junk shop, half art gallery. You know what I mean? There were spaces like the brew house space that was an old brewery that people just sort of started staying in, and it developed into these lofts and then this artistic community. So Pittsburgh, I mean, its scene was amazing for that stuff.
That's really interesting. While I had a time as a full-time photographer and filmmaker, which are both, definitely on the artistic end of things, I was kind of out on my own in some important ways. There were some cultural centers, like in New York at the International Center for Photography, where I first studied. There was some of that, but I also did it sort of mid-career. So I wasn't like a kid who was crashing, in a group house and, that was political campaigns when I looked like that.
Right.
So, which, has some of those features to it of like disparate people doing interesting things intensely on low budgets for important parts of their lives and then going on to doing interesting other things. But it's obviously essential to bump into people and to be in an area where there's a critical mass of people participating in culture and things starting to bloom from that. I don't know if I've told this anecdote on the show in the past, but one of the most interesting talks I ever attended was something that would sound just so boring, it was a presentation by a woman who worked at Steelcase, the office furniture company out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, but she was in Arkansas speaking at an architectural, like the annual convention of Arkansas architects. And she was talking about new trends in office design. Like, that does not sound like an interesting topic, right? But she was talking about how there had been for many years a trend towards offices being designed in such a way that every single chair in the place has their own path to a very easy, direct path to the bathroom or to the stairwell or to the elevators. And what they had found was the offices that were most productive in terms of breakthrough ideas and collaboration they were in older buildings that didn't utilize that design. They had basically bottlenecks all throughout them. So that if you're in the back office in the corner, you couldn't just take your private road down to the bathroom, hit the bathroom, go back to your office without seeing anyone. You had to like go down this hall and then go down that hall. And then all of a sudden there's like 5 people walking in, and then you run into each other in the kitchen, and then you stop and you start talking. And so basically her whole point was collision points. If you have collision points, then that's where collaboration happens, and that's where entities blossom. And I've never been able to get that out of my mind. It's like, it makes so much sense on why it's important to live in a place where you meet people and you're brought together physically, not just as the crow flies.
I was
right. And
oh, sorry, go ahead, David.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, in Pittsburgh, the interesting thing is we had all these old warehouses and all these old industrial sites that were now vacant. And so a bunch of photographers got together and started, Silver Eye Photography, right? And my wife had a show. My wife's an artist, and she did this photography show. And it was in McKees Rocks, which is a place that's still going through a lot of, hard times economically. But that means there's warehouses there, right? And so somebody bought the warehouse and turned it into an art center, right? I mean, these places were all over Pittsburgh. There were places in the Hill District. Again, there was a place that was struggling financially and economically, and still is, right? But people would just show up, and certainly one of the biggest art events each year in Pittsburgh is Art All Night. That's in Lawrenceville. That originally they just took over vacant storefronts on the main street, and people would show up with their art, right? I mean, now it's in a warehouse. And I even think they moved it somewhere else now. But the point is, these kind of things really bred artistic collaboration and scenes in the city that would never have happened if we were Denver, right? Which Denver sort of took all of their stuff and said, we're going to put it in this nice clean space and everyone's going to walk, right? And that's not what Pittsburgh ever was. It didn't have the space for that. It didn't have the community for that. It just developed in its crooked roads and winding streets.
Yeah, and
where else
it turns
do you
into
see
economic revitalization as well?
Right. Where else do you see that happening? Either today or back, in the 80s and 90s, when our generation was the ones doing the driving.
That's a hard question. I mean, certainly Seattle, which was originally just a stopover for Boeing, right? I mean, like it sort of has the same story, probably.
Well, and it was a big port town,
right?
And had that kind of grittiness to it,
right? Pittsburgh's unique, I think, in that most of the other Rust Belt cities didn't have the opportunity, or took them a lot longer, anyways, to sort of break through from the industrial past. Cleveland's only really now pulling it out, right? Detroit really hasn't figured it out yet, I think. So Pittsburgh was very lucky that Carnegie and Frick and all these people were here and left a whole bunch of money, and we had this great school system and this university, I should say, and these awesome hospitals and things like that people really wanted to be here for, right? I mean, the Renaissance happened, but if it weren't for those other things, we would have been Cleveland.
Yeah, I think that's right. Atlanta is a place we haven't talked about, but where there seems to be a lot of that cross-pollination going on now between the sort of the rap world and the film world and really the TV world. And I think other arts too. I just don't know anything at all about contemporary art scene, but and that I think doesn't fit the mold of the sort of an old city that provides those nooks and crannies, but that it somehow has come up in some other way.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, you're right to bring it up, but I'm not sure I bring enough knowledge to it. I have on the rap side of things, I have a memory that, and not a rapper, Babyface was a key driver of the growth of the Atlanta black music scene. And but there's more to it, and I didn't do enough research before this to enlighten enough on that front.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to push back on the idea that Detroit hasn't figured it out yet?
Yeah, I thought about that. Detroit certainly has progressed, and of course, even when it was, sometimes it's when these places are, really doing poorly. Those can be the times where there's the most interesting art. Certainly, late '80s Detroit birthed some really important techno breakthroughs, and now what's his name? The Rocket Mortgage guy has poured a huge amount of money into Detroit and revived big portions of it. But it's also, Detroit was, was the first really truly sprawling American city. There's so much, even if there's a lot of revival in Detroit. I remember driving, 8 or 9 years ago through a neighborhood where there's these beautiful old mansions that had belonged to, auto executives back in the day, and they had recently cost as little as $200,000 for this incredible home that was, fallen into disrepair, and those were already pushing $1 million 8 or 9 years ago. So there's been a fair amount of revival in Detroit, and it's continuing, but there's just so much land to improve, and so much, and so much baked in poverty that doesn't just improve because some neighborhoods gentrify.
I think that's a really good point. And I think you need to have that sort of total collapse, right? I mean, Pittsburgh went through that in a lot of its neighborhoods. The place I lived in for a while in college in the North Side, before it was the North Shore, right? It was a horrible place, right? But I mean, you could get a place where I think there were 3 or 4 of us living there, and I paid less than $100 a month, right? I mean, you can't find those kind of opportunities anymore. So it's much harder for scenes to develop when you have a really strong economy, I think anyways, right? Like I remember Jim Morrison from The Doors, he had this interesting quote about how there was the plague, but it was because of the plague that there was the Renaissance, right? Like people, and that's sort of what you need, right? I mean, I'm not saying that we should have another plague.
You're not pro plague? Okay, good. Let's just be clear on that.
Right. But I mean, again, you go from Reagan to Clinton, right? And so I'm always looking for, whenever things are really down and hard, hoping that the next scene is starting to bubble up from that.
All right. So, and I will just note, Detroit has figured out the baseball piece at least, but just to wrap it up, we started out the show in sort of talking about our favorites among, like, so you had the Seattle grunge scene, you had the Athens, Georgia REM B-52 scene. You've got a few years earlier, the downtown Manhattan CBGB's thing. You've got LA, you've got Manchester. Where would you want to be out of all of those? Where would a young Dave Rullo be most at home?
Yeah, that's a hard question for me, because there's 3 scenes in particular. You mentioned all 3 of them that I'm really invested in. The grunge scene, certainly. That's my when I think Gen X, that's what I'm thinking of, right? In everything, the logo design, the music, the clothes, everything about Seattle and grunge is right in the heart of my Gen X, right? But that sort of early 80s downtown art punk scene in New York, God, I love that stuff, right? I mean, it was so experimental, and it bred a whole new generation of artists. I like this band called Warrior Soul, right? Where the guy did a lot of like spoken word stuff in the middle of like, a cacophony of noise and heavy metal, right? But that would have never happened without what had been developed at CBGB's. You know what I mean? Like that scene of just, hey, we're going to try it. I'm going to get up there, and I know nothing about poetry, but for some reason I got a season in hell, and now I'm just going to go up there and sort of do my own version of that, right? So I love that scene. And then certainly I played for a long time in industrial bands. And so that Chicago, Detroit sort of scene of, all of those guys with no guitars, but, a bunch of MIDI and really big old fashioned computers on stage. That really speaks to me as well.
Cool.
Awesome.
Well, that seems like a great place to leave it. Dave, thank you so much. I'll just do another plug here. Gen X Pittsburgh. It is a very, very good read. I highly recommend it to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, good tune.
The X.
I'm there, dude.
The X.
Very hip stuff, Pittsburgh.
The X.
Whoa!
Pittsburgh's new rock alternative at 106.7. Yeah! The X.
So we're back, and let's just get right to the juicy part here. It is time for Wormholes, the moment on our show when we share a little bit of something that we, in true middle-aged dad fashion, have learned or discovered or just decided it was important to tell people about this week. And by luck of the fact that we pretty much always go in the same order, you go first.
The wormhole for me today is appropriate to today. I didn't design it this way. It was really just the thing in my head. But as we were driving my son to college in two cars, and I was solo in the one I was in, all of a sudden a memory of music wafting down the Oberlin halls in college came back to me. And I was like, I haven't listened to that album in a long time. And it was the Stone Roses debut record. Yeah. And I think I had not listened to a single track on that record for 20 years. And sometimes, that happens not because you get sick of something or dislike it. It's just you kind of goes off the radar.
Yeah.
So I put it on. I put on I Want to Be Adored, the first track, and that long introduction to it that's so epic. And then I just kept playing it, and I've been playing it ever since for like weeks since.
Isn't it fun when you do that? Yeah.
Yep. So I've fallen back in love with the Stone Roses. And it's just an incredible record from beginning to end. And I saw, as I was doing a little extra research, that it was, I think in NME in 2006, called it like one of the best, I might have called it like the best English record ever, or something very, very high. And certainly it's considered among the greatest debuts ever.
There was Sgt. Pepper's was one.
I know.
But, yeah.
I did my research and then promptly forgot my research. I don't think it was the best record ever, but it was like up there.
Yeah.
And it is. It's like there are no weak tracks.
Yeah.
That's always a thing with records is you can have a great track and then you can have 6 or 7 other tracks that are completely forgettable. And is that an indictment of the record? No, because the band could have achieved some greatness with just one single. But when a record is truly memorable from beginning to end for a band at any stage of their career, it's really, really impressive. So bravo.
It's an indictment. It's a thing, just to get it to the ways that things have evolved for us Gen Xers, right? Presumably now, if you were making one of those records where you're like, I've got one great song or 2 great songs, and I don't have to fill out, 2 album sides worth of stuff with this other crap that I've got. It was just such a form dictating content kind of thing back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting now, Spotify is where I listen to music, and the way they debut new records from bands is they still a single comes out in advance, and then maybe a second or a third single come soon after, within weeks or a month of that. And then the whole album is live. It's kind of the same. It's kind of the same format. It's 8 to 12 tracks, and there's not 2 sides. You don't have artwork to luxuriate over.
But It's also though that like that's how you're listening to it, but like I had this conversation not long ago, I think, with my nephew who's like 26 or something, right? Who was making the claim, I don't know if it's true or not, that he's never listened to an entire album front to back in his life, because that's just not how younger people are consuming music, right? And it is, it's just a different.
It's interesting. I believe that my kids will listen to entire records of artists they're pretty keyed up on. So I don't think it's universal for the and they're kind of half a generation away from your nephew, being teenagers. Yeah. Well, anyway, here's the Stone Roses. In fact, there was an interesting quote that Oasis said, if it weren't for the Stone Roses, the Oasis might not exist. And honestly, I like the Stone Roses. I think that debut record is better than any record Stone Roses put out. Although they're
better than any record Oasis put out.
What did I? Oh, did I say Stone Roses twice?
Yeah, but I know what I mean. I just want to make sure the audience did too.
Thank you. I appreciate you helping them through my geezerdom. And yes,
no problem.
That is what I meant. Oasis, lots of great material, though, no doubt about that. But not in that density on one record.
There you go. So I have got a wormhole that, as promised earlier in the program, is horticultural in nature. I just like that word. I like saying that word. There's the great Dorothy Parker line. Of course, you can lead a horticulture, but you can't make her think. Anyway, this was a wormhole that was suggested by a listener. A listener who I happen to be married to. So that's sort of where it all came from. But it is a really cool little online distraction to jump into when you've got a few minutes to spare. And it's an annual event that takes place. It is the Water Lily Way Off. And botanical gardens around the world challenge each other. I think it was started by the Denver Botanical Garden, to see how much weight they can pile onto a water lily before it sinks. And it's amazing, first of all, how much these things can hold, like well over 100 pounds. And then in some of these videos, they're like very earnestly explaining the biology of it. And, and in others, they're having fun. And like the Scottish people were piling beer cans and some kind of Scottish confection on top of it. And like, in other places, they were doing bricks and stuff. And the winning entry from the Orlando area botanical garden was they placed a 183-pound human being on top of the thing, and it held the weight. So it's really, just check it out on, any of the streaming video platforms that you can imagine. It's the Water Lily Way Off. It is a really fun little bit of thing out there.
That's outstanding. That's really good. And I noticed when we talked about how you have a tendency to discount your wormholes, you didn't take the bait and say, yeah, probably today too. You knew you had.
No, I knew I had a winner on this one.
Yeah.
Courtesy of Melissa Selden. So thank you.
Well, she is a great American and you are a wise one for marrying her. So there you go.
All right. Well, you've got the next line.
Oh, do I?
Our
yes, but it's in French.
No, we're not there yet. We're not there yet.
Oh.
That's okay.
Aging is an ugly thing.
We'll fix that in post.
Okay, so yes. Well, all that's left now is to tell folks what's coming next.
Yes, which it'll be a return to our every other episode pattern of talking about another year from our generation's deep, dark past. And the next one's going to be 1979, where, among other things, we will dive a little bit into the Chicago White Sox disco demolition night that happened that year and the whole disco sucks movement that was a part of, which we both agree is a fascinating phenomenon. But it was also that year the release of the first Star Trek movie and 3 Mile Island and the introduction of the Happy Meal. So if you like any of those things, come on back.
I think 3 Mile Island and the Happy Meal are somehow related.
Not in a causal fashion that I'm aware of, but you never know, I guess.
It reminds me that that of my all-time favorite critical diss of a pop culture thing was on the occasion of the opening of Euro Disney, which was not embraced when it opened in France in the 80s or 90s. Well, must have been the 90s, because the way it was described by one critic was it was a cultural Chernobyl.
I heard a really interesting presentation once from we're getting way off topic here, but from the person who took over the marketing of Euro Disney after the initial flop of it, and said that the research showed the biggest problem that it had was that they didn't serve wine. And people were just like, this is ridiculous. What kind of, place would anyone want to go to for a vacation that doesn't serve wine? And so when they changed that was a big step forward.
Wow, that's so interesting. Okay, well,
yeah,
I'm glad we delayed our final lines to explore that beauty. Here, I'll raise this Diet Coke like wine to toast your great knowledge.
No problem. And are you going to say your final line here, Dave?
Good night and good luck.
Oh, you're not doing it. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Au revoir, mes amis. Bonne nuit et bonne chance.
Nicely done.